Every hour, across the world, people hear it. That deep, heavy bell tone cutting through the London air. Big Ben. It's become one of those sounds that just means something, even if you've never been to London, even if you've never stood beside the Thames on a gray morning and felt that bell vibrate in your chest. But here's the thing, nobody really talks about how was it actually built. Not with cranes, not with computers, not with any of the tools we take for granted today. Big Ben was built by hand, by men on wooden scaffolding, hauling iron beams through the London fog, fitting clock gears by candlelight, and casting a bell so massive it cracked twice before they finally got it right. What you're about to watch is every single step of that construction, recreated in miniature. No CGI, no shortcuts, just the real historical process, built tiny, frame by frame, the same way the original was built with patience. So let's go back to 1800 Foudy Foud, back to a bombed-out riverbank and an impossible deadline. Let's build Big Ben from the ground up. Before there was a Big Ben, there was a fire. On the night of October 16th, 1834, the old Palace of Westminster, the home of British Parliament, burned almost completely to the ground. Witnesses described it as one of the most spectacular fires London had ever seen. Crowds gathered on the bridges. Artists came to sketch it. J.M.W. Turner, one of England's greatest painters, stood on the South Bank and painted the flames from life. But once the smoke cleared, the reality set in. Parliament needed a new home. And not just any building, something that would announce Britain to the world. This was the height of the British Empire. Whatever replaced the old palace had to be extraordinary. A competition was launched. 97 architects submitted designs. The winning design came from Charles Barry. Clean, symmetrical, ambitious. But Barry wasn't a Gothic specialist, so he brought in a man named Augustus Pugin to handle the decorative detail. Pugin threw himself into it completely, designing everything from the tower stonework to the door hinges. Two men, one impossible building, and a clock that didn't even have a designer yet. Before a single stone goes down, you have to understand the ground beneath your feet. And in 1840s London, the ground beside the Thames was not exactly inspiring. The riverbank at Westminster was soft, muddy, unstable. Centuries of tidal movement had shifted the soil into something closer to thick porridge than solid earth. Building anything large here was going to be a challenge. Building a tower several hundred feet tall was going to be something else entirely. Survey teams moved in with their equipment, theodolites, plumb lines, measuring rods, everything done by eye and by hand. They drove test stakes into the ground, took soil samples, measured the angle of the riverbank, and mapped the exact position where the foundations would need to go. The findings were not entirely comfortable. The ground would need serious preparation. Deep foundations, significant reinforcement. The site also had to be cleared. Old medieval structures, crumbling river walls, centuries of built-up debris, all of it had to come out before construction could begin. Teams of laborers moved in with pickaxes and wheelbarrows. No machinery, just manpower. It was slow, dirty, difficult work. The kind of work history tends to forget, because nobody paints a picture of men digging mud out of a riverbank. But without it, nothing stands. The ground was ready by late 1840. The real work was about to begin. The foundation of any great structure tells you everything about the people who built it. It tells you how seriously they took the future. Because a foundation is never for today, it's for 100 years from now, 200, 300. The men who built Big Ben's foundation were thinking in centuries. To stabilize the soft Thames-side ground, workers drove hundreds of wooden piles deep into the earth. These weren't small stakes, they were substantial timber beams, hammered down by heavy drop hammers operated by teams of men pulling ropes in coordinated rhythm. The sound would have been constant, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a construction site. Once the piles were in, A massive raft of concrete was laid on top, spreading the enormous weight of the future tower across the widest possible area. Then came courses of brick and stone, carefully laid, checked for level, checked for plumb. Everything was measured by hand, string lines, spirit levels, plumb bobs hanging perfectly still. A millimeter of error at the base could mean meters of lean at the top of the tower. The masons who did this work were highly skilled tradesmen, proud of their precision in a way that doesn't fully translate to modern language. The foundation work took the better part of 2 years. Unglamorous, invisible, essential. When the last course of foundation stone was laid and the ground level was finally reached, the workers would have stood back and looked at what appeared to be almost nothing. A flat, solid platform. But underneath that platform was everything. The reason this tower is still standing today. Now comes the part that people actually picture when they think about historical construction. The part with scaffolding and ropes and men balanced on narrow planks above a growing drop. The clock tower, officially called the Elizabeth Tower today, though nobody really calls it that, rises to 96 meters. That's roughly the height of a 21st-story modern building. Every single centimeter of that height was built by hand. The scaffolding went up first. Wooden poles, lashed together with rope, assembled by specialist scaffolders who worked with a confidence that would make most people's palms sweat. As the walls rose, the scaffolding rose with them, always staying just ahead of the masons, always providing the platform needed for the next course of stone. The stone itself was magnesian limestone, quarried in Yorkshire and transported to London by barge along the coast and up the Thames. Each block was cut to specification at the quarry, but still required dressing and fitting on site. Stone masons worked with chisels and mallets, shaping each piece to sit flush against its neighbors. A simple pulley system rope, wheel, counterweight lifted the heavy blocks to working height. Men guided them into position. Mortar was applied. The block was set. The process repeated. It was slow in a way that modern construction simply isn't. On a good day, the walls might rise by a single course of stone. On a bad day, rain, wind, a snapped rope, a cracked block, progress was measured in inches. But course by course, the tower climbed, and as it climbed, it could be seen from further and further across London. People stopped on bridges to watch it grow. Something was happening on the riverbank. Something permanent. Stone gives a building its face. Iron gives it its spine. By the mid-19th century, Britain was in the thick of the Industrial Revolution. Iron was everywhere, in bridges, in railways, in the bones of new buildings. The clock tower of the new Parliament would use cast and wrought iron throughout its interior structure. And for one critical purpose: to support the enormous weight of the clock mechanism and the great bell that would eventually hang at the top. The ironwork began in foundries across the Midlands. Craftsmen worked at furnaces burning coal, heating iron to the point where it could be shaped, either poured into molds as cast iron, or hammered while glowing as wrought iron. The two processes created components with different properties. Cast iron was strong under compression. Wrought iron was strong under tension. Both were needed. The finished iron components, beams, brackets, frames, fixings, were transported to site and assembled piece by piece. Connections were made with bolts or rivets. Riveting was its own skilled trade. One man heated the rivet in a small furnace, another caught it in tongs, a third held a backing plate, and a fourth hammered the rivet head flat, all in rapid sequence before the metal cooled. Inside the growing tower, iron stairways began to spiral upward. Iron platforms gave workers access to upper levels. Iron frames would eventually cradle the clock dials on all four faces of the tower. The combination of stone walls and iron skeleton gave the tower something its builders clearly intended: permanence. The sense that this structure was not going anywhere. They were right. A clock tower without a clock is just a tower. And the clock inside Big Ben is not just any clock, it is one of the most precisely engineered timepieces of the 19th century, and it still runs today. Designing it very nearly broke the people involved. The original clockmaker chosen for the job was Benjamin Vulliamy, a prestigious name in British horology, but his design was challenged. Experts argued a man named Edmund Beckett Denison got involved, and he was not the kind of person who made things easy. Denison was a lawyer, an amateur clockmaker, and completely certain that he was right about everything. After years of dispute, Denison essentially took over the clock design, and in doing so, he invented something genuinely new: the double three-legged gravity escapement. An escapement is the mechanism that controls the release of energy in a clock. It's the part that makes the ticking sound. Denison's design isolated the pendulum from outside disturbances, meaning the clock could keep accurate time even as the tower moved slightly in wind, even as the bells were struck, even as temperature changed the metal components. The pendulum alone weighs about 300 kilograms. It swings every 2 seconds. At the end of the pendulum is a small coin tray, and to this day, the clock's rate is adjusted by adding or removing old penny coins. 1 penny changes the clock's rate by 0.4 seconds per day. The entire mechanism was manufactured by a firm called E.J. Dent & Co. after Denison designed it. It was transported to the tower and installed piece by piece, hand-carried up the spiral staircases, assembled in position, tested, adjusted, tested again. The first time it ran correctly and continuously, the men who built it would have stood and listened to the ticking and known they had done something that mattered. Now we get to the most dramatic part of this entire story: the bell. Big Ben is not the tower. Big Ben is the bell, the massive 13.7-ton bell that hangs inside the tower and strikes the hours. And the story of how that bell came to be is genuinely extraordinary. The first Big Ben was cast in 1856 at a foundry in Stockton-on-Tees. It was transported to London by rail and river, installed in the tower, and tested. And then, disaster. During testing, the bell cracked. A massive fracture appeared in the metal, rendering it useless. The blame game began immediately. Denison was accused of using too heavy a hammer during testing. He denied this with characteristic force. The bell was melted down and recast, this time at the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in London, the same foundry that had cast the Liberty Bell in America. The new bell was ready in 1858. It was installed, testing resumed, and then, impossibly, it cracked again. Another fracture, another failure. At this point, the project had already run years over schedule. The clock tower had been complete and sitting silent, waiting for a bell that worked. Denison, remarkably, proposed a solution: rotate the bell a quarter turn so the hammer struck a different spot, file down the crack to prevent it spreading, and fit a lighter hammer. It sounded improvised. It sounded like a workaround, but it worked. The crack is still there. If you visit the tower today and look carefully at the bell, you can see it. Big Ben has been striking the hours with a cracked bell since 1859, and nobody who hears it knows the difference. July 11th, 1859. For the first time, the great bell of the new clock tower struck the hour over London. It wasn't a grand ceremony. There was no ribbon cutting, no crowd gathered specifically for the moment. The bell simply struck, as it was designed to, as it had been built, and cast, and cracked, and recast, and cracked again, and repaired, and tested to do. But across London, people heard it, and they stopped. There's something about the sound of a great bell that's different from any other sound a city makes. It doesn't compete with the noise around it. It doesn't fight for attention. It simply arrives, fills the air, and then leaves, and the city sounds different for a moment in its wake. The BBC began broadcasting the chimes of Big Ben in 1923, and from that point, the sound became global. It has marked the end of wars. It has rung in New Year. It has been the audio backdrop to some of the most significant moments in 20th century history, all of it resting on a cracked bell. The men who built this tower, the surveyors, the masons, the iron workers, the clockmakers, the bell founders, most of their names are not famous. They are not in history books. What they left behind is something more durable than a name in a book. They left behind a sound, every hour, still going, 165 years later. This is what it means to build something that lasts. Not speed, not shortcuts, not the fastest method, or the cheapest material. Just craft, patience, and an almost unreasonable commitment to getting it right. Big Ben wasn't built perfectly. It ran late. The bell cracked. There were arguments and failures and long stretches where nothing seemed to be working. But the people involved kept going, and what they created has outlasted every person who doubted it, every delay that threatened it, and every crack that tried to stop it. The next time you hear that bell, even in a recording, even through a phone speaker, think about the wooden scaffolding. Think about the men on the rope. Think about the coin on the pendulum tray. Think about the work that nobody saw. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing. There's a lot more history like this waiting to be rebuilt, one miniature at a time.